Amen. Well, good to see you guys. My name is Kent. If we hadn't had the chance to meet, I'm one of the leaders here. If you have a Bible, turn with me to that passage we just read, Romans chapter 1. Romans 1 is where we'll be here in just a little while. So C.S. Lewis is one of my all-time favorite Christian authors. Anybody else? Yeah. Which is saying something because I've never even read any of the fiction books that he's written. C.S. Lewis has a lot of stuff out there that is not about witches or wardrobes, believe it or not. And so I read mostly the other stuff, the nonfiction stuff. But in one of his books, he tells his readers to imagine this really bizarre scenario, and it's just stuck with me for a long, long time. I think it relates to what we're going to discuss this morning. He basically tells his readers to imagine traveling to a country that they had never been before, a foreign country, and one night while you're there, imagine that you get an invitation to attend some sort of late night club that they have going on, like a social club. And when you show up to this club, the place is just absolutely filled to the brim with people. You can hardly find a seat anywhere, it's so crowded. Everyone in this club grabs their drinks and they sit down at their table, which is sort of surrounding a stage in the front of the room. And at some point, the lights go down in this room, and a single spotlight just shines onto the stage. On the stage, there's a small table covered with a black cloth, and music starts to play. The music starts to pump louder and louder and louder, and as the music is playing, a person on stage just lifts up one edge of the black cloth to reveal that underneath the cloth is a cheeseburger. And they quickly cover it back up. The music keeps playing. The next time they lift up a little bit more of the black cloth to show a little bit more of the cheeseburger, and then they cover it back up, and then a little bit more, and a little bit more is shown. And as all of this happens, people in the club are going absolutely crazy. So people are throwing money at the stage, begging for the person on stage to show them just a little bit more of the burger than before. People are drooling over it, making complete fools out of themselves as all of this happens. C.S. Lewis describes this hypothetical scenario, and he says, if you found yourself in that type of situation, witnessing that sort of thing, you might think a couple things to yourself about that situation. First, you might be inclined to think to yourself, well, maybe people in this country are starving, right? Maybe they're malnourished, which would explain their somewhat irrational behavior towards food in this setting. But then you find out that everyone in this country is actually really well fed, really well nourished. And then you might think to yourself, okay, well, maybe they're well nourished, but they just haven't seen a cheeseburger before. And I mean, as an American, a cheeseburger is an exquisite piece of cuisine, right? And so maybe the problem is they've just never seen how incredible a cheeseburger looks before, and so they're really drawn to it in this really odd way. But then you ask around and you find out that in this country they eat cheeseburgers all the time, constantly consuming cheeseburgers in this country. And then he says, eventually, you might arrive at the conclusion that something had gone deeply, horribly wrong in this country and society's relationship to food. You wouldn't conclude that food is bad. You would conclude that this particular society had elevated food to a really bizarre, confusing, unhealthy sort of place in their life. And with that, as C.S. Lewis usually does, he just asks his audience, could you not say the very same thing about our society's relationship to sex? Today we continue in week 2 of a 5-week series called Theology of Sex. We had quite a few people show up last Sunday as we started this series for the very first time around our church. If you came back, God bless you. Way to go. Really, really impressed, was not expecting that. But if you weren't here last week, we basically just spent 45 minutes or so unpacking everything that sex is meant to be according to the Bible. That's what we covered. And basically, we made the case that the Bible is, on the whole, a fairly pro-sex book. Contrary to the reputation it sometimes gets in our society, the Bible often speaks really, really highly about sex, at least sex within a certain environment. But this week, what we're going to do is pivot a little bit, and we're going to talk about what might have gone wrong in our society's relationship to sex. What's gone wrong with it? If last week was about all the good that sex was designed to be by God, this week is going to be about how sex sometimes becomes bad, or we could just say how it becomes something other than what it was intended to be. And in order to do that, we actually need to talk for a bit about something that, at least on the surface, might seem completely unrelated to sex. Something that the Bible calls idolatry. In order to understand where we've gone wrong as a society when it comes to sex, I would argue that you need an in-depth understanding of idolatry. Now, when many of us hear that word idolatry, chances are we picture something ancient, or at least primitive, right? We envision a society probably very different from the modern West, where people are all dancing around a carved wooden image or statue of some sort, or maybe bowing down to it in worship. And that is certainly a type of idolatry. But I want to show you today that idolatry can actually be a good bit more subtle than that, too. In fact, maybe the most baseline definition of idolatry that I could give you would be something like putting something other than God in God's place. That's what idolatry is at the end of the day. It's putting something other than God in God's place. Taking anything in our life that is not God and treating it or interacting with it like it is a God. So a few weeks ago in our series on the Holy Spirit, Eric and Sarah talked about the idea of worship and what worship is. They said worship is, in essence, to ascribe worth and value to something in your life. And if that's what worship is, I think we could call idolatry a worship disorder. That's what idolatry is. It's a worship disorder. It's when we functionally ascribe too little worth and value to God in our lives and ascribe too much worth or value to things that are not God in our lives. And seen that way, idolatry is not just an issue for more primitive, less enlightened cultures than our own. Idolatry is actually a problem for every single person who has ever lived. There's this famous quote from the late novelist David Foster Wallace where I think he actually articulates this idea of idolatry really, really well. Wallace was not a follower of Jesus by any means, but I think he describes this whole idea so well in this quote. So he once said, "In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And an outstanding reason for choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship," remember, he was not a follower of Jesus, so he thinks there's a few different options here, "is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. For instance," he says, "if you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough, never feel that you have enough. It's the truth. Worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die 1,000,000 deaths before they finally plant you. Worship power, and you will feel weak and afraid. You will need ever more power over others to keep the fear at bay. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart, and you will end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out," and so on. Everybody, he says, worships. Every single person, regardless of whether you would consider yourself a Christian or not, religious or not, spiritual or not, we all worship something. We all have something in our life that we are most passionate about, something that we ascribe worth and value to in tangible sorts of ways, something that we orient the rest of our lives around. We all have something in our life that we are ready and willing to give our time and our attention and our energy and our resources over to constantly. And if that thing is not God, it's going to be something else. Because whenever God is not occupying that ultimate place in our lives, it essentially creates a vacuum. Something else will take his place, whether we realize that's what's happening in our hearts or not. And the term for that trade, that exchange in the Bible, when something else takes the place of God, is the word idolatry. It's actually precisely the trade that Paul is getting at in our passage that we heard read this morning. So take a look with me again at Romans 1, starting in verse 21. It says this: "For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God or gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools." And notice this next part: they exchanged, they traded the glory of the immortal God for images. In other words, idols, made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles. In Paul's language, idolatry is exchanging the glory, the worship of God, for other things. Making a trade, at least functionally, in your heart, to take God out of his rightful place of worship and put other things in God's place instead. And Paul is telling us here in Romans chapter 1 that that trade has been happening in human beings since the very beginning of time. It looks different in different places and in different cultures, to be sure. Sometimes it's more obvious and sometimes it's more subtle when it happens, but it always, always happens. As human beings, we don't know how not to worship. It's just a matter of what we choose to worship. Now, once you understand this, I think it helps make sense of why some people do some of the otherwise inexplicable stuff that they do in their life. Why people make decisions in their life that otherwise don't make a lot of sense at all. So I once knew a guy who, from the moment he graduated college, he worked 80-plus hour weeks at every single job that he took. And as you might expect for someone working 80-plus hour weeks, he had virtually no hobbies, no friendships. His family hardly ever saw him. He lived a really isolated existence outside of work. His physical health suffered along with his mental and emotional health, because that's what happens when you ongoingly work 80-plus hour weeks. But here's the thing. His job never asked him to work 80-plus hour weeks. It wasn't like he just went on Indeed.com and exclusively applied for jobs that were 80-plus hours a week. That would be crazy. That's like a death wish, right? That's not what happened with him. It wasn't that at all. It was just that wherever he worked, he insisted on working that many hours of his own will and volition. He would take his laptop home every single night and on the weekends and work on stuff that nobody was actually asking him to work on. And listen, while I'm all for having a good work ethic, I think most of us would agree that that is a pretty unhealthy pace of life to run at for any amount of time. Having that kind of work-life imbalance is not a great idea for anyone. So here's my question. Why would he work that many hours and lead that unhealthy of a life, even though no one was asking him to do it? I would argue it's because he worshiped his work. And specifically, he worshiped the success and career advancement that came from his work, such that he was willing to sacrifice a whole lot of other good things in his life for that thing to be satisfied. He was, in essence, offering the rest of his life as a sacrifice at the altar of career success. Okay, so do you see how that's actually a form of worship? There may not be a carved image up on a pole that he's dancing around and offering sacrifices to, but there might as well be. Because everything in this guy's life is effectively being sacrificed to that God of success. His family, his potential friendships, his mental and emotional and physical health, all of those things are being heaped upon the fire and burned so that the God of success can be satisfied in his life. And I could give you countless other examples that I've seen through the years. Things that people worship instead of God. People that worship money. People that worship health and physical fitness and their bodies. People that worship the approval and acceptance of others. People that worship politics and political figures and political ideologies. People that worship their family or their spouse or their kids. The list goes on and on and on. There is no shortage of things that people end up giving their time, attention, energy, and resources to, sometimes in really excessive and bizarre sorts of ways when they worship something other than God. And here's what's so tricky when it comes to idolatry. The things that we make into idols in our life at a functional level generally aren't bad things on their own. Often they're really good things. So work, believe it or not, according to the Bible, is a good thing. God created us to work in the very beginning before sin even entered the picture. Being a good steward of your body and physical health is a good thing. Politics, at least in its original form, which just means the systems and structures set up to organize societies and make them function, that's a good thing. Your kids, your marriage, your family, all of those are good things. The problem with idolatry is not that we care about these other things. The problem with idolatry is that we've elevated them to a place that they don't belong. It's that we've turned good things in our life into ultimate things. Am I making sense? Okay. Now here's where all of this connects to our current teaching series on sex. I think it is very difficult to make the case that we have not made a cultural idol out of sex in our society. A cultural idol out of sex. So I once heard a missionary describe a trip that he made to a developing country elsewhere in the world. And while he was there, he visited this village where they had set up literal idols, so wooden carved images that people in the village would worship and sacrifice to. And while the missionary was there with the people from this village, he started noticing and observing that a lot of their idol worship centered on the idea of rain. So they would sing songs about rain to their gods. They would ask these gods to provide them with rain. They would even have dances of celebration when, in their view, these false gods provided them with rain, when it came through for them, in other words. And after observing all of these things, the missionary decided to ask one of the people in the village about it. He said, "Hey, why are all of your songs about rain?" And the person he asked explained to him, they said, "Well, rain is how we live. Rain makes our crops grow, it gives us water to drink, it replenishes the land. Rain is the most important thing in our life to our survival." And then, without even skipping a beat, this person from the village turned to the missionary and said, "So why are all American songs about sex?" Sometimes I think other societies see us more clearly than we do. Here's my point. When we reject the true Creator God in functional ways, one of the more popular choices to replace Him tends to be sex. And here's the thing, if we know our Bibles, this should not be surprising to us at all. Keep reading with me in our passage from Romans chapter 1. Pick it back up in verse 24. "Therefore, in light of this idolatry, therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to" what? "Sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshiped and served created things like sex rather than the Creator, who is forever praised." Amen. According to Paul, this specific trade is nothing new. When humans reject God, one of the first things they try to replace Him with is sex. As one author I read put it, quote, "When we functionally eliminate God from our life, sex might be the only transcendent experience we have left." So just do your best to think about this objectively with me for a moment. What types of things would you expect to see in a society that worships sex? Well, you might expect to see an economy based on it. You might expect to have a porn industry, for instance, that is worth somewhere between $15 and $97 billion. That is more than the revenues of Major League Football, basketball, and baseball combined. You might expect to see a global online dating industry worth somewhere around $12 billion, the vast majority of which is now not centered on helping you meet people, but helping you hook up with people. You might expect marketing companies to rely on sexualized images and video to sell nearly every single consumer product under the sun, from shampoo to fast food. Anybody remember Hardee's commercials from the early 2000s? unhinged, right? I mean, just what in the world does this have to do with a cheeseburger? I don't understand. Maybe there's a connection between sexual idolatry and cheeseburgers. That's what we're learning this morning, right? You might expect also a platform like OnlyFans to boast 130 million users, not all of whom are watching adult content, but enough of them are to where the platform had to immediately reverse its decisions a couple years ago to ban adult content because so many people threatened to leave the platform over it. You might expect people in our society to be unable to talk about sexual expression and sexual identity without resorting to name-calling and inflammatory language towards each other. You might expect there to be a society that always values the authority of science to define our reality, except when it comes to a person's sex determining their gender. Then all bets are off. You might expect there to be an epidemic of sexual violence in that society to the point that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 5 men are victims of it. And I could go on with examples, but I think the evidence before us is pretty clear. We have a worship problem. At least at a societal level, we worship sex. So again, please hear me on this. This is very important, especially in light of everything we talked about last week. None of this is me saying that sex is bad. It's me saying that when we worship sex like it's a god, it goes bad. Because sex is not a good god. It never has been. You see, the thing about worshiping things that are not God is that they simply are not made to hold up under the weight of our worship. When you expect sex to deliver something into your life that it was not designed to deliver, one of two things will happen. Either you will find yourself perpetually frustrated and disappointed and disillusioned with those sexual experiences, or you will become irrationally convinced that the next sexual experience, the next hookup, the next relationship will bring you the satisfaction that you're looking for, despite all past evidence. And listen to me, it's a mirage. It will not work. You will never arrive at the spot you want to arrive at. And listen, even if you think you have arrived, Romans 1 would actually say that's God's wrath towards you. It's God's wrath for him to allow you to think that the fullness of life is found in something other than him. Because that's not where life is found. Not true life. And listen, this is not just a cultural issue for me. I see the impact of sexual idolatry nearly every single day as a pastor. People wrecking their marriage because of a sexual addiction of one form or another. Husbands and wives ending their marriages because they think it would be more fun to participate in hookup culture. People abandoning their spouse because they've decided that somebody at work would offer a slightly more satisfying sexual experience than their spouse does. People sitting in years of compounded sexual shame left over from past experiences. People walking away from Jesus because he will not sign off on their preferred sexual lifestyle, whatever that might happen to be. All of this is the damage caused when we give our lives over to something that will not hold the weight of our worship. What our society absolutely will not tell you is that there is a dark underbelly to the sexual revolution. The sexual revolution, the movement that started in the 60s and in many ways has gotten us to where we are today, has left an unbelievable number of casualties in its wake. From marriages to families to mental health, even people's very lives. When we worship things that are not God, there is always damage done as a result, whether or not we're ready to recognize it as such. In the words of David Foster Wallace from that quote earlier, pretty much anything you worship will eat you alive. Our society won't tell you that, though, because it doesn't fit the narrative they're selling. They've pushed all of their chips in on worshiping sex, and whatever happens, they've got to keep throwing logs on the fire, and they need you to do it too. Back in Paul's day, the worship of sex was actually really obvious and overt. In many of the very cities where he started churches, people worshiped the Greek goddess Aphrodite. She was quite literally the god or goddess of sex. I was going to show you a picture of her, but all of them are quite busty, so I decided not to. Didn't feel like that was a good look. But they worshiped the Greek goddess Aphrodite. She was the god of sex. People would travel from all over the ancient world to visit Aphrodite's temple and worship. And there, as an act of worship, they would have sex with their pick of over 1,000 temple prostitutes. In other words, your act of worship to the god of sex was to have sex with someone you barely knew. To appease the goddess of sex, you would have to give your body, your sexuality, your money, your innocence over to her. You would, in many ways, become a slave to Aphrodite, doing anything it took to appease her. And I would argue that from that perspective, Aphrodite is alive and well in 21st century America. She's just dropped her proper name. Today, she requires just as much of your body, just as much of your attention, just as much of your blind devotion, and just as much of your worship. She will demand that you make sacrifices to her. You will have to give up your bodies, your sexuality, your money, your time, your innocence over to her in worship. But you see, somewhere along the line, Aphrodite made a brilliant business decision. She started convincing everyone that her type of slavery is actually freedom. That giving all of your time and money and effort and sexuality and innocence over to her is actually a liberating thing for you to do. And boy, has that marketing tactic of hers been effective on a whole lot of different people. And just to be honest, it hasn't just worked on people that don't follow Jesus. It has often worked on us too. For instance, when followers of Jesus convince themselves that the reason to get married is sex, and therefore get married as quickly as possible, regardless of red flags they might see in the person they're about to marry, that's worshiping the god of Aphrodite. When followers of Jesus secretly wrestle with a porn addiction, convinced that they don't need to tell anybody else about it because it's just porn and everybody else struggles with it too, so they stay enslaved to it for years. That's the worship of the god of Aphrodite. When we consume movies and shows and books that glorify lust and sexual sin in really unhealthy ways, and we convince ourselves that it's no big deal because, quote, at least it's not porn. That's Aphrodite at work. When a person harbors bitterness towards their spouse because their spouse is not meeting their sexual needs sufficiently in their mind, and that bitterness starts souring the rest of the relationship as a whole, that's the worship of Aphrodite. When we refuse to allow people in our life group to call us out on sexual sin or even ask questions about relationship decisions that we're making, that's the worship of Aphrodite. When we're too nervous to call out obvious sexual sin in the lives of other followers of Jesus, that's her too. When we openly celebrate the sexual lifestyle choices of others, even though we say we believe those lifestyles are sinful. All of that is the worship of Aphrodite, the god of sex. Do you see this? Just because you're a follower of Jesus does not mean you're not unknowingly worshiping sex with parts of your lives. And I want to help you see something. In our previous teaching series, we talked about the reality of spiritual evil, right? I would argue that part of the reason the worship of sex is so pervasive in our culture is because there are likely real spiritual beings behind it. Beings that would love for you worshiping something other than God to be a normative experience. For that to become the spirit of our age like it has. And precisely because the worship of sex is such the spirit of our age, chances are there are many ways that many of us are worshiping sex and we don't even realize it, because that's the water that we swim in. So the question we need to answer practically is, if that's true, if that's possible that we could be worshiping sex in unhealthy ways, what exactly do we do about it? How do we resist the urge to worship Aphrodite like the society around us so often does? How do we stop worshiping her if we already do? Well, one thing surprisingly that we don't do is just try to stop. That pretty much never works, just as a warning. If you have built your life around something other than God, such that the majority of your time and energy and effort and resources are going towards that thing, chances are you're not just going to be able to wake up one morning and suddenly stop doing it. Because remember, as humans, we are natural worshipers. We don't know how not to worship. It's just a matter of what we worship. But what you can do, I would argue, is learn how to worship something else more than sex. Simply put, you worship your way into idolatry, so you also worship your way out of it. One follower of Jesus back in the 19th century called this the expulsive power of a new affection. In other words, you let a new, more powerful affection in your life replace a lesser one. So God's instruction to those who have worshiped other gods, including sex, is not just stop doing that. His instruction is worship me instead. He doesn't first say stop enjoying this very enjoyable thing. He says learn to enjoy me more. Which, when you think about it, is so very helpful, because what most people tend to do when they get disillusioned or tired of pursuing one idol is that they just replace it with another one. Right? So you get tired of worshiping sex, so you start worshiping success instead. You get tired of worshiping success, so you start worshiping approval in the eyes of your peers. You get tired of worshiping approval, so you start worshiping comfort and luxury instead. And on you go. We keep trading out one idol for another until every single one of them has chewed us up and spit us out and left us no closer to the life that we wanted or the life that it promised. As we said earlier, idolatry loves a vacuum. Even if we're successful at not worshiping one God, our heart will often hunt down and find another idol to set up in its place. As it's been put before, the human heart is an idol factory. And to all of that, you might say, okay, well, how is worshiping God any different? Isn't that just the same thing? Aren't we just suggesting that we trade out the worship of sex for the worship of God? That seems like the same futile task, just trading one God out for another. But it's not the same thing, and here's how. The God of the Bible is different than all the other gods you might worship, because the God of the Bible is the only God who sacrifices for his worshipers instead of the other way around. The God of sex will ask you to sacrifice your time, your energy, your resources, your body, your innocence, your conscience to her, and will never give you anything in return except fleeting pleasure and shame. The God of the Bible, though, sends his son Jesus to sacrifice everything for you, to give you a greater joy and to take away your shame. He's the only God that sacrifices himself for the good of his worshipers. In Mark chapter 10, Jesus makes it clear that this is precisely what he came to earth to do. For there it says, "For even the Son of Man," that's Jesus himself, "the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." So that word ransom in that passage is a very specific term for Jesus to use. It's quite literally the word used for purchasing a slave out of slavery. Jesus is implying that you and I, and for that matter, every single person who has ever lived, we are all enslaved to something. We are stuck in the cycle of worshiping something other than God, and whatever that something happens to be, it has us doing all of its bidding. Sacrificing everything that we are and all that we have to that idol. But what the one true God has sent Jesus to do is purchase our freedom out of that. To give everything, his very life even, so that you and I can go free from that cycle. And yes, following Jesus does indeed look like learning to orient our entire lives around him. giving over our time and energy and resources and affections to him. But listen, here's the difference. None of that is done in an effort to appease him. It's done as a response to what he's already done. As a way of imitating, wanting to be like Jesus, the God who gave up everything for us. Do you hear the difference in that type of worship? It's substantial. Jesus says the Son of Man came not to be served like idols demand to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Our God is the God who sacrifices himself. And that makes him altogether different from every other God that there is out there. So where does that leave us? I think it means that if we've experienced that sacrifice from Jesus, that ransom through Jesus, that means we can and should lay everything down and worship before him as a response. So we give our minds to him. So we spend time saturating our minds in the scriptures and in his design for our sexuality more than we saturate our minds in our society's definition of sex. I think it looks like giving our efforts towards him. If we're married, giving ourselves over to a biblical expression of sex with our spouse, which we'll talk about more in detail next week. If we're unmarried, it looks like honoring God by giving ourselves over to God's design for our singleness, meaning abstaining from sex until it's time or indefinitely if we're called to singleness. It looks like giving our time over to him. Spending our days loving and serving other people, sacrificing our days and our weeks to the things that the scriptures call us to, more than we spend our time consuming media that shapes our hearts around a warped view of sexuality. And it looks like giving our resources over to him, spending our money more on kingdom things than we do on trying to attract people's attention for all the wrong reasons. All of that, giving your mind, attention, efforts, time, resources over to Jesus, that's worship. We worshiped our way into idolatry, and so now Jesus gives us the ability to worship our way out. And as we do that, we ask the Holy Spirit by his power to use all of those things to shape our hearts and our affections around Jesus and his kingdom. But we do all of that as a response to what he's already done for us. And as we do that, we get to watch the Spirit form this countercultural community around us where sex can be good, but not God. Where sexual intimacy can be celebrated without needing to be worshiped. Where it can be pursued in healthy ways without it ruling over us and enslaving us as a result. And the more that happens, the more we create that type of countercultural community, the more we show off to the world around us that there's a better way forward, a more compelling way forward. We become that city on a hill that Jesus talked about that cannot be hidden, a lamp that gives light to everyone in the house, and there is perhaps no arena where our society needs a picture of a better way forward more than in the arena of sex. So as we respond this morning, we're going to go to the tables. We're going to celebrate the ransom given for each of us, where Jesus went to the cross. He gave up his life so that you and I could be rescued out of whatever idolatry we find ourselves wrapped up in. However far into any of that you've gone, there is nowhere that the grace of God cannot go. There's no depth that Jesus cannot reach into, no situation that he won't enter into. He came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So if this morning you realize that you may have been taken captive by the god of sex and you want freedom from it, there will be a team of people down front that would love to talk through that with you. They would love to pray over you in that and point you to whatever resources might be helpful. So don't hesitate to come forward and ask them to help with that as we respond and celebrate the grace of God together. Let me pray.